Hey everyone, it is week 8, and we are going to dive into the post Enlightenment. This is the period of time immediately following, and to a certain extent, kind of overlapping the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. These two ideologies are coming to blows. They're going head to head with one another. As it says down here, you need to have read chapter 19, Revolutions in Politics, and then there's a section of chapter 21 that I want you to read. You don't need to read the entire chapter. You certainly can. Nothing wrong with that. But within the chapter, there's a section called What Were the Characteristics of the Romantic Movement. You need to read that section. I think in my copy of the textbook, it's like page 640. But I understand a lot of you have different versions, and I don't know what page numbers will be for that. But as long as you look for that section, that section of chapter 21, which is called Ideologies in Upheaval, look for the section, What Were the Characteristics of the Romantic Movement? Okay, now, there's a lot of material for me to cover, so I don't want to delay that too long. However, I do want to mention just very briefly that you're only getting material from me this week. If we were in the classroom, this would have been a week where I was responsible for a lecture both on Tuesday and on Thursday, right? So I've got a lot of material here. And what I've gone ahead and done is broken it up into sections from the very beginning. Like I've already pre-planned the different sections that we've got here. And I'm going to give them to you in the order that they should be watched, as well as some supplemental stuff that I'm going to ask you to take a look at as well. All right? Cool. So let's move on then to a period of time that is often referred to in Western history as the Age of Revolution. Why this was the case was that there were a lot of different revolutions that happened in Western civilization. The first one that we'll talk about is the Industrial Revolution. It's the dates for when it began and ended are wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, but it's often said to have started somewhere around 1760 and to have continued on until 1820. Other sources put it to 1840. Some will put it to the early 1900s, in fact. But at least the main bulk of it happens over what's essentially about a 80-year period, thereabouts, in which there was a transition to new manufacturing processes. It marked the major turning point of history in almost every aspect of life, as life, at least on a general level, transitioned from agrarian to industrial. And there was this rapid expansion of cities at the time as population began to grow and as the systems of manufacture moved from agrarian cultures to factories within cities. This expansion of cities starts to happen. Some important things like the train, the locomotive was invented in 1802. It comes along during this time period, which suddenly makes for much faster travel across the continent, not only in Europe but also in the Americas, Africa, in Asia as well. It might be a bit before, well, in the 1800s, sure, we started getting some railways in Australia, in South America as well. Right, so this makes for a boom that begins to happen. So it is this time of just absolutely unprecedented growth. The average income of human beings in Western societies begins to skyrocket. The population of Europe, which had taken kind of a pretty bad hit in the 17th century, starts to boom. Again, a lot of that can be because of improvements in healthcare, improvements in the quality of life that came from the average income growing, things of that nature. Then there's the rise of the urban middle class. All right, we've already kind of been talking about them. Right, in France, they're referred to as the bourgeois. In English, we just sort of refer to them as the middle class. This is this new group that rises up and is not quite at the status of being super, super wealthy like the aristocracy or the nobility, but they're doing well for themselves, and they're mostly located in urban areas, right? This new urban class was able to enjoy things like an increased leisure time. They started to reject the established politics of the time. Like I said, we've already kind of talked about that. Right, they're the ones who are going to be leading the French Revolution that we'll talk about again here in a moment. There are also some grievances against industrialization that's going to fuel later revolutions. Right? And the Industrial Revolution did not come about without its problems. You can see even in this image right here of a factory that these are not adults. Right? These are children being used for these factories. There was the danger inherent in a lot of these factories before a lot of safety measures were put into place. There was the fact that there was suddenly a bit of a return to something not unlike feudalism from the Middle Ages, where suddenly people were working very hard on producing goods, services, what have you, but then the person who had been working very hard did not own the means of production or the thing that was produced itself. Someone else owns that, right? The person who owns the company that you work for, right? Things of that nature. And that's because, and it sounds to us perhaps like, well, of course, isn't that how it's always been done? But not so much, right? There's been plenty of times throughout history when goods and services were produced by people who owned both the means of producing and the finished product. And they were the ones to then choose whether to sell or share or barter or what have you. There were those who complained that the Industrial Revolution sure was building up this urbanized middle class, but that urbanized middle class wasn't getting its fair share of this grander world that it was producing, and that however, as that burgeoning middle class is rising, there's this huge group that's even worse off below, that's even larger, that is really getting the raw end of the deal. And so it's those kinds of grievances that are going to also bring about later revolutions. Then we have the American Revolution. American Revolution takes place between 1776 and 1783, when the 13 colonies of British America became independent by means of the Declaration of Independence, which was heavily influenced by Enlightenment and neoclassical ideology. You have Thomas Jefferson, who was a huge fan of France. And he's looking at what's going on in France, and a lot of the Declaration of Independence is built upon Enlightenment ideas. Then that brings about the War of Independence, again, which takes place between 1776 and 1783. When the colonists eventually are victorious against the British Empire, and then decide, because when the revolution first happened, all of the different states were planning to be their own separate nations. Once the decision was made to become a conglomerate of states, a constitution was put into place. You'll recall again the idea of constitutionalism is a 17th century ideology. It's been slowly being put into place in Europe, but in most cases they were constitutional monarchies. It was keeping a king or queen in power, but the people sort of had the right to vote and things of that nature as well. In the case of the United States Constitution, it established a democratic republic, right? And set up this idea of a system of checks and balances, right? We have each branch of government has its checks and balances on the other branches, and again, each branch has checks and balances on itself from the other branches of government. The 3-branch government with an elected head of state. That was a new idea. There had been discussions about whether or not there should be a king, and the worry was that a king would always be able to place himself above everyone else, right? Always. It would, and then wouldn't we just be right back where we started, back with this idea of sort of God, wholly ordained rulers. We don't want that. Instead, we're going to make a head of state, the president, who will be elected by the people, and that person's power will be checked by other branches of government. And so no one branch has all of the power. There was this ideology of property rights. Boy, could we get into that, but just understand it's a thing in the Constitution. And ingrained in the Constitution was the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. Right? So this is fairly radical ideas, right? That built into the Constitution, it is a set of rights that all human beings are supposed to have. Now, I know, right, there's been the history of the United States is extremely, extremely blemished by slavery, by the role that women were put into. Women weren't allowed the right to vote until 1920. Only a little over 100 years ago. And so yes, the Constitution as it was originally written was first and foremost meant for white men. That's just all there is to it. but it wasn't written that way, which is why it made it helpful over the going on 3 centuries since, that um, that it could be amended and it could be tweaked without changing the original language. And that original language, as I mentioned before, was very rooted in neoclassical ideas about how human beings are capable of reason. We are all capable of reason. And as such, we should all be treated as individuals and equals. No one person should be above anyone else. These are the ideals, okay? I know how it has been actually put into practice. There's all kinds of craziness that we can get into there. But at least what was written down, the words as written, suggests that if everyone is equal, then any kind of government that is in place should be put there by the people it governs. It should be held accountable to the people it governs rather than the other way around. And that the government can pass all kinds of laws that it might, but what it is not allowed to infringe upon is anything that is inside your head, right? Your freedom of speech, the freedom of the press is more a thing of getting the stuff out to the people so that again the government can be held to task. And religion, right? The Declaration of Independence says that we have inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of those things are the stuff that you have inside your head, and the government shouldn't be allowed to muck with that, right? That for the time was fairly radical. We'll see in a bit that the French Revolution had even more radical ideas. It just wasn't successful. The American Revolution, on the other hand, was. So we get to the French Revolution, at least the first of them. French Revolution, which goes from about 1789 to 1799, was a period of radical social and political upheaval in France that profoundly affected French and modern history. There had been in France this economic crisis following some wars. There was the French and Indian War, and France had helped the United States, or I guess I should say the British colonies, in their war for independence. And this left France in like hot water when it came to their finances. Now, and their economy. Now, this is going to be explained a lot more in depth in a video that I'm going to ask you to watch from a group, from an outside source. So I'm not going to dive into this just too much. But the resulting revolution, which again had very similarly to the American Revolution, they kind of had their version as well of the Declaration of Independence and what their ideas of how a constitution would run. Because again, recall, up until this point, France has been a monarchy, right? There is a king and a queen. And the revolutionaries who rise up begin this, and this battle begins, and it becomes extremely bloody on both sides. Their demands for change, they were anti-aristocracy. They wanted the aristocracy gone. Right? No one should have that kind of a position just by birth, is what the revolutionaries would say. They were anti-royalty, at least most of them. There were several who wanted to have a constitutional monarchy. But at the very least, they felt that the monarchy needed to be held more accountable to the people because they felt that the monarchy had become completely and utterly out of touch with everyday common people. Again, this is all overlapping what we've already looked at, right? These are the same people who were complaining about the way the aristocracy lived their life, right? And that their ways of doing things was antithetical to the burgeoning middle class's way of thinking and their traditions. Again, it was influenced by Enlightenment neoclassical ideology, just like I mentioned a moment ago with the American Revolution. But it was more influenced by hunger and inequality. Right? The French the French revolutionaries, some of them, sure, were intellectuals, no doubt about it. But a lot of people were just sick of being hungry and living in a crashing economy and being able to look at the aristocracy and the royal family and see the wealth and extravagance that they lived in. And they wanted to put in place something that would get rid of that. And so there's this call for democracy. They want to put a democracy in place just like the United States did. And there's this, and this is not just, I think, in France, this is all around the Western world. There's this sudden call for patriotism as well. Right? Patriotism and nationalism. That nationalistic call is becoming all the stronger as we get into the post-Enlightenment. So at this point, I'm going to stop this first video of the different parts, and I'm going to give you a link to this video as well. I want you at this point to go and watch a video by the Crash Course World History guys that is about the French Revolution. Go watch that and then come back for part 2 of my lecture.